What if the foods linked to some of the world's longest-lived people aren't expensive superfoods at all, but foods you may already have in your kitchen? For years, we've been told that living longer means finding the perfect supplement, following a complicated diet, or buying the latest miracle health food. But when you look at the traditional diets of people living in the world's blue zones, something surprising stands out. Their meals aren't built around exotic ingredients. They're built around simple, ordinary foods: beans, whole grains, vegetables, fruits, nuts, and other foods that have been part of traditional diets for generations. And that matters because healthy aging may have less to do with finding one magical food and much more to do with the patterns behind what you eat every day. Now, to be clear, eating one food from this list isn't going to magically make you live longer. But when you put these foods together, a fascinating pattern starts to appear. And by the end of this video, you'll not only know 12 foods commonly found in blue zone style diets, but you'll also understand what they have in common and why that may be more important than any single food on the list. And pay close attention to number 1, because it's one of the most ordinary foods you'll hear about today. Yet there's a very good reason it deserves a place on this list. Let's start with something that probably doesn't look like a longevity food at all. Beans. They're cheap. They're simple. And because they're so ordinary, it's easy to overlook just how useful they can be. Yet beans and other legumes repeatedly appear in the traditional diets of several blue zone populations. And the interesting part isn't that beans are some magical superfood. It's that they can do something much more practical. They can turn a simple meal into a filling, fiber-rich foundation without needing anything fancy. A bowl of beans paired with vegetables, whole grains, herbs, and a little healthy fat can become a satisfying everyday meal. Not something you need to eat once in a while because it's healthy. And that may be one of the biggest lessons hidden in the blue zone diet. The foods that show up again and again aren't necessarily expensive, exotic, or difficult to prepare. They're foods people can eat regularly, simply and as part of normal meals. So maybe the real secret isn't finding a miraculous food. Maybe it's making ordinary, nutritious foods so much a part of your routine that eating well doesn't feel like a special effort anymore. And beans are only the beginning, because the next food is another everyday staple that many people probably don't think of when they hear the word longevity. Next up are lentils, small and inexpensive and easy to overlook, but there's a reason they deserve a place on this list. Lentils have been a staple in traditional diets for generations, and they're remarkably easy to turn into a satisfying meal. They provide protein and fiber, along with a range of nutrients, while fitting into everything from soups and stews to simple bowls with vegetables and grains. But the most interesting thing about lentils may not be what's inside them. It's how easy they are to make part of everyday life. You don't need a special recipe. You don't need an expensive ingredient list. And you don't have to treat them like a health food. You can cook a pot, season it simply, and build an entire meal around it. And that's an important distinction. A food can be incredibly nutritious, but if it's expensive, difficult to prepare, or something you only eat occasionally, it may never become a meaningful part of your routine. Lentils are almost the opposite. They're affordable, versatile, filling, and simple enough to eat again and again. And now we're starting to see something bigger. The foods on this list aren't just nutritious. They're remarkably practical. But the next food takes that idea in a completely different direction. It may look like nothing more than a simple side dish, yet it can add an entirely different dimension to a traditional meal. Now let's talk about something most of us eat regularly: grains. But there's an important difference between a grain in a relatively natural form and one that's been heavily refined. Think about oats, barley, brown rice, and other whole grains. These foods keep more of the original grain intact. When a grain is refined, some of those original parts are removed. So what ends up on your plate can be quite different from where it started. And this is where the blue zone pattern gets interesting. The lesson isn't that brown rice is a magic longevity food, or that you need to throw away every white grain in your kitchen. It's much simpler than that. across several blue zone regions. Traditional meals commonly included foods that were simple, recognizable, and minimally processed. Imagine the difference visually: a whole grain, then a refined grain, and finally a highly processed food made from refined ingredients. With each step, you're moving further away from the original food. And that's an important distinction. The goal isn't to find one perfect grain. It's to notice how often traditional meals were built around foods that still look like the foods they came from. That may be one of the most useful clues hidden in these traditional diets, because the next food is something almost everyone knows they should eat, but many people still manage to leave sitting on the side of the plate. Now we come to a food that almost everyone has been told to eat, but many people still try to avoid it: leafy greens. Think spinach, kale, chard, collard greens, and other dark green vegetables. They may not look exciting, but they can provide your body with fiber, vitamins, minerals, and a variety of natural plant compounds. And here's what makes this interesting. You don't need some rare vegetable imported from another country. You don't need a mysterious powder with a complicated name. Something as simple as a handful of spinach added to a meal can bring more plants into your diet. This is another clue hiding in plain sight. Look at the foods we've covered so far: beans, lentils, whole grains, and now leafy greens. Notice something? Nothing on this list requires a supplement bottle. These are ordinary foods that people have been eating for generations. And perhaps that's the part modern diets make easy to forget. Healthy eating doesn't always have to be complicated, expensive, or trendy. Sometimes the most useful foods are the ones we've been walking past in the grocery store for years. But our next food is different. It's tiny, crunchy, easy to overeat, and surprisingly valuable when you get the portion right. Next up is something incredibly small but surprisingly useful: nuts. Almonds, walnuts, pistachios, and other nuts have long been part of traditional diets in different parts of the world. And while they may look like nothing more than a quick snack, they can provide a combination of healthy fats, plant protein, fiber, vitamins, and minerals. That makes them an easy addition to an everyday diet. You could have a small handful as a snack, sprinkle some over oatmeal, add them to a salad, or simply include them alongside a meal. You don't need a complicated recipe to benefit from them, but there is one important catch. More isn't necessarily better. Nuts are nutritious, but they're also quite calorie-dense. That means a small handful can be plenty. You don't need to eat an entire bowl just because they're healthy. And that's another important Blue Zone lesson. These foods aren't treated like magic ingredients. They're simply small, satisfying parts of a larger eating pattern. So far, we've seen beans, lentils, whole grains, greens, and nuts. But now we're getting to something that can make all of those foods taste better. And it happens to be one of the most famous ingredients in Mediterranean-style eating. Now we come to a food that shows why healthy eating doesn't have to mean eating bland or boring meals: olive oil. Olive oil has been a major part of Mediterranean-style cooking for generations. It's especially useful because it contains mostly unsaturated fats, which are generally considered a healthier type of fat when used in place of less healthy fats. But there's another reason olive oil matters, and it has less to do with nutrition and more to do with enjoyment. Think about a plate of plain vegetables. It might be healthy, but you may not look forward to eating it every day. Add some olive oil, herbs, garlic, or spices, and suddenly those same vegetables can become something you actually enjoy. The same goes for beans and whole grains. And that may be an overlooked secret of a healthy diet. The best diet isn't necessarily the one that looks perfect on paper. It's the one you can actually enjoy and stick with for years. People in traditional longevity regions weren't necessarily forcing themselves to eat foods they hated. They had flavorful, satisfying meals built around simple ingredients. And the next food is even sweeter. But unlike candy or sugary desserts, it comes straight from nature. Next is something that almost everyone recognizes, but many people underestimate: fruit. Berries, grapes, oranges, apples, figs, and other fruits have been part of traditional diets for generations. They naturally provide fiber, vitamins, minerals, and a variety of beneficial plant compounds. And there's an important difference between eating an actual piece of fruit and consuming something that's simply fruit-flavored. A whole orange comes with fiber and takes time to eat. A sugary drink that tastes like orange can deliver a completely different experience. The same goes for fruit snacks, sweetened desserts, and heavily processed foods that use fruit flavor without being anything like the original food. That's why the blue zone pattern is worth paying attention to. It's not about avoiding everything sweet. It's about choosing whole foods in their more natural form more often. And fruit can make that incredibly easy. A handful of berries, a piece of fruit after dinner, or some sliced fruit with breakfast doesn't require a complicated recipe. But we're about to reach a food that may surprise you, because the next one isn't usually marketed as a longevity food at all, and yet it's been a traditional staple for generations. Now here's where we challenge a belief that has become very common. Carbohydrates are bad for you, but sweet potatoes tell a more complicated story. Sweet potatoes and other traditional tubers have been part of everyday diets in different cultures for generations. They're a source of carbohydrates, but they also provide fiber, vitamins, minerals, and other nutrients. So the problem isn't simply that a food contains carbohydrates. What matters is what the food actually is, how heavily it's been processed, how much you eat, and what the rest of your diet looks like. Compare a simple baked sweet potato with a highly processed snack made from refined ingredients. Both may provide carbohydrates, but they're very different foods. And this is another pattern we keep seeing. Traditional longevity diets often weren't built around complicated rules like never eat carbs. Instead, they relied on simple, recognizable food prepared as part of ordinary meals. A sweet potato alongside vegetables and beans is a very different meal from constantly reaching for ultra-processed snacks. So if you've spent years believing that every carbohydrate is something to fear, this is worth remembering. The food itself matters more than the label we give it. And next, we're moving to a food that has sparked plenty of debate, but has been eaten traditionally for centuries. Now we come to a food that has been the subject of plenty of debate. Soy. But before getting lost in controversy, let's look at how soy has traditionally been eaten. Foods like tofu, tempeh, and edamame have been part of diets in parts of Asia for generations. These foods can provide plant-based protein, fiber, and a range of nutrients, making them useful additions to everyday meals. And there's an important distinction here. We're talking about traditional, recognizable soy foods, not every highly processed product that happens to contain soy as an ingredient. Tofu can be added to vegetables. Edamame can be eaten as a simple side dish. Tempeh can become part of a satisfying meal. Nothing about these foods requires a complicated diet. But we also shouldn't turn soy into another miracle food. Eating tofu doesn't guarantee a longer life. The interesting part is how foods like these fit into an overall eating pattern. And now we're seeing something important. These diets aren't built around one superstar food that supposedly does everything. They're built around combinations of simple foods, beans, grains, vegetables, fruits, nuts, and other minimally processed ingredients working together. And next, we're going to look at a food that shows Blue Zone diets aren't necessarily completely plant-based. Now we come to a food that may challenge another assumption. Not everyone living in a Blue Zone follows a completely plant-based diet. Fish appears in the traditional diets of some Blue Zone populations, particularly in certain Mediterranean and island communities. It can provide high-quality protein and beneficial fats, making it a useful part of a balanced meal. But there's an important detail here. Fish isn't eaten in the same way or in the same amount across every Blue Zone. Some populations eat it regularly, while others rely much more heavily on beans, grains, vegetables, and other plant foods. So the lesson isn't that everyone needs to start eating fish to live longer. In fact, that's exactly the point. There isn't one perfect Blue Zone diet. Different regions have different foods, traditions, cultures, and cooking methods. Yet despite those differences, one pattern keeps appearing. The emphasis tends to be on simple, minimally processed foods rather than heavily processed meals. So fish can certainly fit into a healthy eating pattern, but it isn't a magic ingredient. And now we're getting closer to the most interesting part of this list, because the next food isn't just about nutrition. It's connected to an ancient way of preparing and preserving food that may surprise you. Now we come to something much older than modern health trends: fermented foods. For generations, people have used fermentation as a simple way to prepare and preserve food. The process is actually quite fascinating. Helpful microorganisms break down parts of food over time, changing its taste, texture, and sometimes even its nutritional qualities. And fermented foods look very different depending on the culture. You might find fermented soy foods, such as tempeh or miso, as well as fermented vegetables and other traditional foods around the world. You may have also heard that fermented foods are automatically great for your gut. There's some interesting research in this area, but it's important not to turn that into a miracle claim. One fermented food isn't going to transform your health overnight. The bigger blue zone lesson is much simpler. These foods were often part of traditional eating patterns, long before anyone was putting the word superfood on a package. And now we've reached a very important point. We've looked at 12 different foods, but what if the individual foods aren't actually the biggest story? Because after looking at all of them, there's one food category that may tell us more about longevity than any single food on this entire list. And now we've reached number one. But instead of revealing some exotic food you've probably never heard of, we're coming back to something we've already seen several times: legumes. That means foods like beans, lentils, chickpeas, and other similar plant foods. And this is where the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. Legumes show up repeatedly in the traditional eating patterns associated with several blue zone populations. They're affordable, filling, versatile, and provide fiber, plant-based protein, vitamins, and minerals. But perhaps their biggest advantage is how easily they can become the foundation of a meal. You can combine beans with vegetables, lentils with whole grains, chickpeas with herbs and olive oil. Instead of building every meal around heavily processed foods, legumes can help create meals from simple, recognizable ingredients. And that may be the real lesson hiding behind this entire list. Maybe the secret was never finding one magical food. Maybe it was building everyday meals around simple foods like these and eating them consistently for years. Because when you look at all 12 foods together, something becomes clear. Longevity may have less to do with one miracle ingredient and much more to do with the pattern created by the foods you eat every day. So, after looking at all 12 foods, here's the question worth asking. Did people in blue zones really discover some secret food that helped them live longer? Maybe not. Maybe the bigger story is that they simply never stopped eating the simple foods that modern diets gradually push aside: beans, lentils, whole grains, vegetables, fruits, nuts. Simple, recognizable foods that don't need a health claim printed on the package to be valuable. And that's perhaps the most important lesson from all of this. You don't need to completely transform your life tomorrow. You don't need an expensive supplement cabinet or a perfect diet. Sometimes, improving your everyday meals can start with something incredibly simple. Eat more real food, choose less processed options, and make those choices consistently. Because longevity may be less about finding something new and more about returning to what has worked for generations.